It began not with the clash of swords or the roar of a collapsing empire, but with a single, almost imperceptible tremor in the heart of the Eternal City. By the year 410 AD, Rome had already endured centuries of grandeur, conquest, and unimaginable excess. Marble statues gleamed in sunlight. Aqueducts carried fresh water across the city like veins in a living organism, and the Colosseum echoed with the cheers of tens of thousands. To the citizens who walked its streets, Rome was eternal, invincible. But history is rarely as kind as it seems. The forces that would shatter Rome did not appear overnight. For decades, the Western Roman Empire had been weakened by internal decay, political corruption, and economic turmoil. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, their claims to power often legitimized by bribes or the swords of mercenary generals. Meanwhile, the borders of the empire were under constant pressure from migrating tribes, desperate to find land, food, and safety. Among these groups, the Visigoths, a Gothic people who had been displaced by the Huns in the east, had grown restless. Once enemies of Rome, they had become uneasy allies, or so the empire believed. Their leader, Alaric, was a brilliant tactician with a singular ambition to secure a homeland and provisions for his people. But the Roman Senate, preoccupied with their own intrigues and underestimating the threat, dismissed warnings of impending disaster. By August of 410 AD, the city was teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Alaric and his army had surrounded Rome. Inside the city, fear spread faster than rumors. Nobles fled with their treasures. Common citizens prayed in temples, hoping their gods would intervene. The Visigoths were no longer a distant threat, they were at the gates. When Alaric's forces finally breached the walls, the siege was brief but devastating. The invaders moved with a calculated restraint, unusual for the era, avoiding indiscriminate slaughter in favor of looting the wealth that Rome had hoarded for centuries. Gold, silver, priceless works of art, sacred relics, all were stripped from temples, homes, and the Senate itself. Yet even amidst the chaos, the city's infrastructure, its roads, aqueducts, and buildings remained largely intact, a haunting reminder that the world of Rome was slipping away, not with a bang, but with a deliberate, unstoppable march. For the citizens, the psychological blow was far greater than the physical one. Rome had not fallen to an enemy in living memory. The idea of the eternal city, eternal no longer, sends shockwaves across the known world. Poets wrote of the tragedy, Christians interpreted it as divine punishment, and survivors fled to the countryside or across the sea, carrying with them fragments of a civilization that had once ruled the Western world. The fall of Rome in 410 AD did not mark the immediate end of the Western Roman Empire, but it was the day the illusion of permanence shattered. It was a warning that even the mightiest city could crumble under pressures both internal and external. And for the rest of Europe, the lesson was etched into memory. Empires rise on the backs of ambition and order, but they fall when those foundations are undermined by greed, fear, and human frailty. Centuries later, historians would look back at that fateful day and recognize it as a turning point, a moment when the world that had been dominated by Roman authority began to fragment into kingdoms, tribes, and nations. Yet even in ruin, Rome's legacy endured. Its roads became the arteries of new civilizations. Its law influenced distant societies, and its art and culture inspired generations far beyond its fallen walls. Alaric did not live long after his conquest, and the Visigoths eventually moved on, leaving behind a city scarred but unbowed. Rome would rise again, in different forms and under new rulers, but the memory of that day, the day Rome's glory died, remains eternal, a haunting echo of what it truly means for a civilization to face the inevitability of change. The Eternal City had always believed itself untouchable. It was a place where marble met sunlight, where triumphal arches celebrated victories over nations that now existed only in memory, and where the Senate argued endlessly, confident that Rome's foundations were unshakable. Yet, by the early 5th century AD, cracks had appeared that no marble could conceal. The Western Roman Empire was hemorrhaging power, both literal and symbolic. Economic collapse had hollowed out the treasury. Inflation ran rampant. The once mighty legions had thinned, stretched across borders they could no longer defend effectively. Political assassinations were commonplace. Emperors often ruled for mere months before being replaced or killed. Rome's glory, once a beacon to the world, had begun to fade. Into this weakening empire came the Visigoths, displaced and desperate, yet remarkably organized. Alaric, their leader, was no barbarian in the simplistic sense that Roman propaganda had painted him. He was a strategist, a visionary, and above all, a man determined to secure a future for his people. The Roman Senate's refusal to recognize their legitimate claims, a homeland, provisions, and respect, would set the stage for one of history's most shocking events. Alaric's march toward Rome was not swift, but methodical. His army, seasoned from years of warfare, moved with purpose. By the summer of 410 AD, they encircled the city, cutting off supply lines and leaving Rome isolated and vulnerable. The psychological toll on the citizens was immense. Rumors of betrayal, of secret deals, and of impending massacre spread faster than Alaric's army. Panic and despair pervaded even the opulent villas of Rome's elite. When the Visigoths finally breached the city's walls in late August, the events that unfolded were both terrifying and strangely restrained. Unlike the sackings of the past, Alaric ordered his men to spare lives, focusing instead on the wealth that had been hoarded for centuries. Temples were looted of their treasures, Senate halls stripped bare, homes of the aristocracy emptied. Precious works of art, sculptures, mosaics, jewelry were taken, some destroyed, some carried off. Yet Rome's streets, its aqueducts, and its grand structures were largely left standing. The fall of Rome was not merely physical, it was deeply symbolic. To the citizens, it was a loss that transcended material wealth. The Eternal City, whose image had inspired awe and fear for centuries, had been humbled. Christian scholars interpreted it as divine judgment. Poets lamented it as the death of civilization itself. And the world beyond Rome watched in disbelief. Letters and chronicles from Alexandria to Gaul spoke of the unthinkable, the end of the age of Rome, and the day when the city that never dies first wept.
Yet, amidst the chaos, survival and adaptation emerged. Many Romans fled, taking what they could: family heirlooms, gold, and memories of a city that had defined their lives. Some sought refuge in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman capital, which would continue as a beacon of Roman governance and culture for nearly another 1,000 years. Others joined smaller kingdoms and tribes across Europe, carrying fragments of Roman culture into new lands. Alaric himself did not linger. He continued to pursue his people's security, ultimately dying a few months later. The Visigoths moved on, leaving Rome bruised but not broken. Over time, the city would endure successive waves of invaders, from Vandals to Ostrogoths to Byzantines. Yet each time, Rome adapted, its identity morphing while retaining echoes of its former grandeur. Historically, the sack of Fort 10 is significant not because it ended the Western Roman Empire immediately. Rome would limp on politically for another 66 years, but because it shattered the psychological perception of invincibility. It proved that even the mightiest civilization could succumb to pressure, mismanagement, and internal decay. The event became a reference point in Western thought, a lesson in hubris, preparation, and resilience. The legacy of Rome did not vanish with its sacking. Roads once paved by Roman engineers connected emerging kingdoms. Legal codes influenced nascent European states. Art, architecture, and literature continued to reflect Roman ideals. Yet for those who lived through the events of 410, the city's fall was as personal as it was historical. The theft of gold, the looting of temples, the fear that the world as they knew it might end. In retrospect, the day Rome's glory died was not a simple story of conquest. It was a profound testament to the impermanence of power. Rome, like all empires, was vulnerable to both external forces and the failings within. Its fall was a warning echoing through the centuries. No matter how grand, how eternal, how unstoppable a civilization seems, it can collapse under the weight of neglect, greed, and human frailty. And yet, even in ruin, Rome's spirit endured. The eternal city would rise again, not as the empire that had conquered the Mediterranean, but as a cultural and spiritual hub shaping religion, art, and law for generations to come. The day Rome's glory died was, paradoxically, the day it truly began to live on in memory, legend, and history.
Rome was a city of contradictions. Marble temples gleamed in the sun, while the alleys behind them reeked of human toil. Gladiators fought for glory and survival. Senators plotted with whispers and daggers, and merchants jostled to sell spices, wine, and silks from across the empire. To outsiders, it seemed eternal, an empire that could never fall. But beneath the glittering surface, the foundations were cracking. By 410 AD, Rome was a city that had seen centuries of power, yet was worn thin by mismanagement, civil war, and economic strain. The Western Roman Empire was like a patient teetering on the edge of a precipice. Emperors changed with dizzying speed, often assassinated or overthrown, while corrupt officials siphoned wealth from the treasury. The legions, once feared across the Mediterranean, were overstretched and poorly supplied. Rome's borders were porous, its citizens fearful. And then came Alaric. Alaric, the Visigothic king, was not merely a conqueror, he was a strategist and visionary. Displaced by the Huns, his people were desperate for safety, food, and land. Alaric's genius lay in understanding the weaknesses of Rome, a city proud of its past, blind to the present, and slow to respond to threats. For years, he negotiated with the Roman Senate, seeking recognition and provision for his people. Time and again, he was rebuffed. Pride and politics blinded the Romans. By summer 410 AD, Alaric had surrounded Rome with his army. News of the approaching Visigoths spread terror. Within the city, citizens faced a grim choice: stay and risk slaughter, or flee with what little they could carry. Aristocrats hurried to secure treasures, while ordinary Romans clutched family heirlooms hoping for mercy. In the temples, priests offered prayers to gods old and new, their voices trembling as the sounds of war drums approached. When the Visigoths finally breached the walls, the chaos was both immediate and surreal. Alaric's men moved with purpose, avoiding mass slaughter but stripping Rome of centuries of accumulated wealth. Gold, silver, and art flowed out of temples and palaces. The Senate's halls were emptied of treasures, mosaics torn from walls, and statues toppled or carried away. Citizens watched in stunned silence, realizing the city they believed eternal was vulnerable. Among the chaos, stories of heroism and survival emerged. Lucius, a young senator, hid his family in the catacombs beneath the city, using tunnels that had once carried water to escape detection. Claudia, a merchant's daughter, bribed guards to save her father's small collection of silver coins, which would become their lifeline in exile. Soldiers who survived the siege recounted tales of Visigoth discipline and restraint, an astonishing contrast to the brutality Rome's people had feared. The psychological impact of Rome's fall was profound. Across the empire, letters and chronicles recorded disbelief and mourning. "The city that never dies has wept," wrote a Christian monk, his words echoing in monasteries from Gaul to Alexandria. Poets lamented the event as the death of civilization itself. In the East, Constantinople shuddered at the news, recognizing the fragility of even the most powerful cities.
Alaric, true to his purpose, did not linger. His mission was survival and security for his people, not conquest for conquest's sake. He continued to move his army, leaving Rome scarred but still standing. And though he died months later, his legacy was etched into history. The fall of Rome was a warning, a symbol of both the inevitability of change and the consequences of ignoring reality. The sack of 410 did not immediately end the Western Roman Empire. It would linger for decades, but it shattered the illusion of invincibility. Rome's story became a cautionary tale, repeated by scholars, historians, and storytellers for generations. Even the mightiest civilization can crumble when internal weakness meets external pressure. And yet, from the ashes, Rome endured. Roads built by Roman engineers became the bloodline of emerging European kingdoms. Roman law influenced medieval courts. Latin survived in scholarship, religion, and culture. Art, literature, and philosophy continued to echo the ideals of a fallen city. Rome, though humbled, remained eternal in spirit. Centuries later, travelers would walk the streets and marvel at what remained: temples, forums, and arches still standing, testaments to human ambition and ingenuity. They would read chronicles of that fateful day, imagining the fear, the courage, and the sorrow. They would see the day Rome's glory died not as an end, but as a pivotal chapter in the story of civilization, a story of resilience, transformation, and the enduring power of memory.